Dances with Wolves was released in 1990 and was directed by Kevin Costner in his directorial debut and is based on the book of the same name by Michael Blake, who also penned the screenplay. It follows Lieutenant John Dunbar, who is assigned to a remote Western Civil War outpost and finds himself engaging with a neighboring Sioux settlement, causing him to question his own purpose. Dances with Wolves is a film I've become very familiar with over the years. I know its status as a classic, I know it won Best Picture, and it happens to be one of my dad's favorite movies. But I didn't end up seeing the movie until I was probably in middle school, and I can't say I really remember that experience all too well. I thought the film was good at the time, but didn't have much to report back on. It wasn't until around 2015 or so when I bought the Blu-ray that I'd actually get to have a solid opinion on the movie. Now, that Blu-ray copy I have only comes with the extended version of the movie, which has a runtime of nearly 4 hours. And since it's been so long since I've seen that original theatrical cut, the extended version is the one I'll be discussing mostly. It was really interesting, though, going back to watch this film, which at this point I think is maybe my 4th time, but it was interesting watching this with my girlfriend who wanted to see it, especially with all the comparisons that have been made between this film and the Avatar films, which we both rank as 2 of our favorite movies ever. So, I was curious to watch this movie looking at those comparisons to see if there's any validity in them, as well as looking at the film itself. So, those are the 2 things I want to try to accomplish in this review, but first, let's do what we always do here and go behind the scenes to see just how this film was made. Michael Blake initially wrote a spec script for Dances with Wolves in the 80s, where it went unsold. However, it wasn't until working with Costner on the 1983 film Stacy's Nights, which he wrote, that Costner recommended turning the screenplay into a book to help its chances of getting sold. Doing this also had its challenges, as the book was rejected by numerous publishers, but eventually made its way to paperback in 1988, at which point the rights for the book were bought by Costner himself with hopes of directing it for his directorial debut. Costner and his producing partner, Jim Wilson, initially had difficulty raising money for the film, and the project was turned down by several studios due to the Western genre no longer being popular due to the box office disaster of Heaven's Gate in 1980, as well as the script's length. The film languished at Nelson Entertainment and Island Pictures due to budget reasons as well. Eventually, Costner and Wilson enlisted the help of producer Jake Eberts to manage the foreign rights and ensure Costner retained final cut rights for the movie. They finally made a deal with Orion Pictures, who distributed the film in America. Production of the film, though, began on July 17th and lasted until November 23rd of '89. Most of the movie was filmed on location in South Dakota, mainly on private ranches, with a few scenes being filmed in Wyoming as well. The bison hunt scene in particular was filmed at the Triple U Buffalo Ranch outside Fort Pierre, South Dakota. The music for the film was composed by John Barry, who was most well known for his work on the music for the James Bond franchise, and the movie's director of photography ended up being Dean Semler, who, before Dances with Wolves, had worked on The Road Warrior and Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. The movie is also important for its use of the Lakota language that's used by the Sioux in the film. Doris Leader Charge served as the language coach for the film, who actually has a role in the movie as the chief's wife, and she had actually taught the Lakota language at university, and her people's language is forever immortalized in that film, which I think is so cool. Dances with Wolves was finally released in the US on November 9th of 1990 and was a box office hit, making $424.2 million on a budget of $22 million. The film received positive reviews from critics and ended up on many top 10 lists for the year. The film would eventually go on to win Best Picture for that year and was the first Western to win since 1931's Cimarron. Now, with all of that out of the way, let me give you my thoughts on this epic film. Dances with Wolves is a great film in general, and every time I watch it, I find myself swept up by the time period, the Lakota people, and the music and the cinematography of the film as well. But on the opposite side of that, I find the film, at least the extended version, to be long, dragged out, and the main character himself just very flat. However, the film is still epic and very well made, and I see why it won Best Picture, even though I feel like Goodfellas was the clear winner for that year. Dances with Wolves also is just a very familiar story that we've seen before in other films and plenty of times afterwards. It is the simple story of a man who visits an exotic new land, has run-ins with natives and learns about them, falls in love with one of their own, and eventually joins them, rejecting where he came from. This is one of the reasons I wanted to discuss this film, because people use this film and other films like Pocahontas, which shares a similar story, to attack films like Avatar, which also has a similar story and clearly borrows elements from this movie, and I'm here to say that's completely okay. You see, when you talk about a story in simple, broad strokes like that, these films all seem the same, which I think completely misses the point. There's a huge difference between plot and what the film is actually about. The plot of Dances with Wolves, and even Avatar, is what I already mentioned. A man visits a new place, falls in love with the natives, and turns on his own people to become one with the natives. But what the story is where these two things diverge, and where both films are wholly unique. Dances with Wolves is about the death of the American West. Our main character brings this up in a scene early in the film where he is stationed out west. Dunbar tells them he wants to be stationed on the frontier before it's gone. This is because he knows eventually more people will come, settle, and take the land, and perhaps its beauty with it. The film ends with the Lakota having to relocate from their original home. That's what Dances with Wolves is about. As with Avatar, the movie is a science fiction fable about American colonialism in a futuristic setting, showing what happened before can and will happen again. When you look at the films that way and not look at the plot beats, they are two films with similarities, but they are not the same. I just wanted to get that out of the way because I will defend Avatar till the day I die. And because Avatar is often compared to this film, this felt like the best time to bring this up. I think talking about what the film is about is a good place to start, though, because it's the most interesting aspect of the movie to me, and what makes it a lasting film to actually discuss. We see these great sweeping shots of the landscapes, beautifully photographed, but through this, we see just how wide and vast this bit of untamed land is. It feels sacred, like a place untouched by greed or the modern world. The film has many scenes of Dunbar learning about the Sioux, their customs, and their way of life, and in that sense, we are seeing what makes the West in the first place. It's a beautiful, harsh, and untamed environment, and all of this is under threat of being stripped away from the Sioux and the land itself. The second buffalo scene is a prime example of this. We see how men have killed herds and herds of buffalo, not even taking the decency to take them for their meat, but only their hides. It shows in a very blatant way how the West will soon be stripped of its beauty. Now, this scene isn't the most historically accurate, but it's a great example of selling the theme of the film, and is probably one of the best scenes in the whole movie. Next, I want to bring up the Sioux in the film. This, to me, is the best aspect of the film, and one of the things most people talk about when leaving this movie is the portrayal of the Sioux Nation, but particularly the Lakota people. I don't know how accurate it actually is, but you end up coming away from the film with a love and appreciation for these people. They are so interesting and well realized, with so many different characters with their simple but fun quirks. I fell in love with the friendships and bonds between Kicking Bird, Graham Greene's character, and Lieutenant Dunbar. To me, their friendship is the central aspect to this movie, more so than the romance that blossoms. There's also Rodney A. Grant as Wind in His Hair, who is also a fun character and is at first a bit distrusting of Dunbar, but there's smaller characters such as Smiles a Lot, who goes through this own character arc by the end of the film. But Mary McDonnell shines as Stands with a Fist, a white woman that was taken by the Sioux when her family was killed by Pawnee Raiders. She's very good in this film and is just a strong presence overall. There's many great moments littered throughout this film, such as the relationship between Dunbar and a wolf he calls Two Socks. I love this wolf, and he ends up basically becoming a character in the film, but it's really cool getting to see Dunbar start out as this soldier, and by the end becoming not necessarily one of the Lakota people, but at least accepted by them, and willing to fight for them, or keep them safe. It's yet another very good character arc. I also want to bring up how well I think this movie starts. The setup is great, and the opening scene is iconic as we enter a tent during the Civil War where Dunbar is about to lose his leg, and instead of letting them do it, he puts his boots back on, suffers through the pain, and performs a suicide charge that ends in failure. But this charge gives the men the drive to push back the enemy and win the day. I also love the lead up to him visiting his new post. He visits with a commanding officer at another depot who questions why he would ever want to go out into the savage frontier. It perfectly sets up the dangers he's to face while on the trip, and I just think it's a very well done first act. The film gets a whole lot more interesting when we are introduced to the Lakota Sioux through Dunbar as he attempts to coexist with them and eventually befriends them. One of the best scenes ever put to film, though, is the buffalo scene where Dunbar joins the others in a buffalo hunt. And just the sheer amount of buffalo they're interacting with the actors on screen is just jaw-dropping. And the fact that no accidents occurred, from what I can find out, is a testament to the production crew's work on the film, as well as animal trainers, because this had to be an incredibly dangerous scene to film. Now, I want to, of course, briefly bring up the cinematography of the movie. Every shot of the movie is like an old Western painting depicting the West. It's beautiful, and I'm guessing they used some natural lighting to get these shots, but the locations are majestic and grand, and the entire scope is that way. The battle scenes are shot viciously, and it has that makings of just a grand American epic that we just don't get as much of today. This is just a beautiful looking film, and even has the score to match it. Honestly, besides the portrayal of the Lakota people and being witness to their beautiful language and their way of life, the score is probably my second favorite thing in the film. It's a sweeping soundtrack with all the grandness an epic deserves, and I still think about it after finishing the film. Lastly, before we go into some of my criticisms of the film, I have to mention how solemn the ending actually is and how it connects to what the film is actually about: the death of the American West. The film ends with this title crawl about how eventually Native Americans were pushed farther off their land and submitted, and the American frontier passed into history. The death of the West in Dances with Wolves refers to the freedom, openness, and the Native Americans that populated it being taken away from it and moved as we push into the modern era of the U.S. It's an incredibly sad ending and is very effective. However, we now have to get into my negatives with the movie, which there isn't that many, but it does harm my enjoyment, especially with this version of the film. As I mentioned, I watched the extended version, and it runs for nearly 4 hours, and it ultimately causes some pacing issues, especially in the first half of the film. And it feels like we're following Dunbar in real time to his post, and there's just scene after scene of him traveling and fixing up the fort, and an added scene of the people that were originally posted there leaving. It just should have been condensed down. Because of this, I want to revisit the theatrical cut because I feel my issues with this version will be fixed there. Also, I have to bring up the romance of this film, and I have to say I don't really like it or even really feel any kind of emotion towards these two. And part of it is everything with them is played so over the top, they act like two human beings that have never kissed a person in their life, and they're just all over each other, and it comes off as purely awkward. To me, there's just very little chemistry between the two actors, and that leads to another point I want to make, and that is, I like Kevin Costner. I think he's a great actor, but he just feels so bland in this film. It's not just the performance, which is very monotone, especially during his narration, but the character of Dunbar is just the least interesting character in the film and really lacks much of a personality. It just makes the entire role dry for me and dampens my enjoyment quite a bit. But at the end of the day, even with those problems, I think this is a great film. It feels like an old school epic with a great cast, beautiful music, and cinematography, and gives an interesting voice to the Lakota people. I understand why this won Best Picture, even if I feel like it really shouldn't have. I just have this feeling the better version of the movie is the theatrical one that won awards in the first place. But with all of that said, I'm going to give Dances with Wolves an 8 out of 10. The first half made me very nervous. I was enjoying it, but I couldn't say I loved it. But the second half really pulls through and makes it worth watching. It's just not a film I can revisit too often. But what do you think of Dances with Wolves if you've seen it? Let me know, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And stay positive.